Kalorama, a recorded books hybrid imprint, presents The Poverty Paradox: Understanding Economic Hardship Amid American Prosperity by Mark Robert Rank, read by Barry Abrams. Publisher's note: the print and ebook versions of this book include visual elements. You will hear the visuals discussed and referenced in this audiobook. Part 1. Overview. 1. Introduction. This book has been quite some time in the making. Across a number of years, I have researched, taught, and written about poverty. In my opinion, there are few topics of greater importance. It is a dominant and disturbing feature of the American landscape. Yet despite the hundreds of books, articles, reports, and programs addressing the issue, the United States continues to have the highest rates of poverty among the wealthy countries. The question is, why? Why should a nation with the resources that America possesses be plagued by the amount of poverty it has? The paradox of poverty amid prosperity has puzzled social commentators for decades. Central to this puzzle has been the question of causality. It is fundamental to understanding this troublesome subject. What causes poverty, and why does it persist? Much of the debate in America has been rooted in the question of causation. How we choose to address poverty is highly dependent on what we view the reasons to be. In the United States, the causes of poverty have typically been thought to lie within the control and behavior of individuals. Consequently, those who are poor are perceived as less motivated, as possessing lower levels of ability, having made bad decisions in their life, and so forth. On the other hand, those who do well economically are viewed as hardworking, having considerable ability and talent, and exerting good decision-making throughout their lives. There is a sense of deservedness embedded in this perspective. Those who do well deserve it, and those who do not likewise deserve their fate. I argue in this book that such a viewpoint is inadequate for explaining poverty. Rather, what I have called a structural vulnerability explanation of poverty is developed. Simply put, the argument is that poverty ultimately results from failures at the economic and political levels. There are not nearly enough opportunities and resources to support the entire population. This is the fallout of both free market capitalism and political decision-making. The label itself combines two key elements of the theory. First, poverty is ultimately structural in nature. Second, a large number of individuals and families are economically vulnerable as a result. I first outlined the structural vulnerability perspective in my 1994 book, Living on the Edge: The Realities of Welfare in America, where I sought to understand the realities of surviving on the social safety net as opposed to the stereotypes and myths surrounding the issue. Through dozens of interviews with welfare recipients, it became clear that these were individuals who had worked hard their entire life and wanted the best for their families. The explanation of laziness or lack of motivation did not seem to apply to the vast majority of women and men I talked to. 10 years later, I examined the topic of poverty in greater detail in the book One Nation Underprivileged: Why American Poverty Affects Us All. The emphasis here was on developing a new paradigm for understanding poverty, including the structural vulnerability framework. A third book, Chasing the American Dream: Understanding What Shapes Our Fortunes, explored the meaning and pursuit of the American dream. Once again, aspects of the structural vulnerability perspective were used to shed light on the dynamics of economic fortune and misfortune. Most recently, in the book Poorly Understood: What America Gets Wrong About Poverty, my co-authors and I discussed the various myths and misconceptions surrounding American poverty. We argued that poverty is an issue that has been widely misunderstood by the American public. In The Poverty Paradox, I turned to the manner in which I believe we should understand such poverty, rather than continuing with our stereotypes. The book is divided into 3 sections. Part 1 is designed to provide a background into the dynamics of poverty, as well as how Americans have traditionally viewed poverty. Chapter 2 reviews some of the ways in which we can conceptualize and measure poverty, along with data on the overall likelihood of poverty. Chapter 3 explores what we might call the traditional American perspective, which is grounded in an idealized image of a society with abundant opportunities, where hard work is rewarded by economic prosperity. Poverty is therefore seen as largely the fault of the individual. Anyone willing to work hard should be able to avoid poverty. Several prominent social science theories are also discussed. In Part 2, the structural vulnerability framework is described in detail. This perspective stands in sharp contrast with the traditional ways we have understood poverty. Each chapter covers a different component of the model. In Chapter 4, it is argued that essential to an initial understanding of poverty is the concept of economic vulnerability and an awareness of the importance of the lack of human capital in accentuating such vulnerability. Individuals more likely to experience poverty tend to have characteristics that put them at a disadvantage in terms of their earning ability within the labor market. These include factors such as fewer marketable skills and less education. Given that education and skills bear on poverty by causing varying degrees of vulnerability, why are individuals lacking these in the first place? Chapter 5 posits that a major reason is the role of cumulative inequality. This is the second component of the structural vulnerability framework. The chapter details how social class differences beginning at birth often result in the process of cumulative inequality, leading individuals to have greater or lesser amounts of human capital and therefore having a greater or lesser likelihood of experiencing poverty. A third component of the structural vulnerability perspective is the realization that there are two levels to understanding impoverishment. Chapter 6 takes up this issue. On the one hand, we can identify who is more likely to experience poverty by understanding the impact that human capital has on individual economic vulnerability. On the other hand, we can ascertain why poverty occurs in the first place by looking at the wider structural failings that occur within the United States. These include failings at both the economic and political levels. Our economy simply does not provide enough decent-paying jobs for all in society, and our social policies fail to protect individuals from falling into poverty. Chapter 6 concludes by pulling together these three components of the structural vulnerability perspective and discusses the framework as a whole. In Part 3, the final section of the book, I apply the structural vulnerability perspective to the wider social and policy context. Chapter 7 ties the structural vulnerability perspective to several core values that the policy ideas in Chapter 8 are built on. The importance of reinforcing a set of key principles is accomplished by addressing the dynamics of poverty outlined in the structural vulnerability model. In Chapter 8, various policy ideas are laid out that can effectively reduce the extent of poverty and economic inequality. They follow logically from the structural vulnerability understanding of poverty. These policies include ensuring that jobs pay a livable wage, providing a robust safety net, increasing access to key public resources, building assets, and organizing. The book concludes in Chapter 9 with some thoughts about moving a structural vulnerability understanding of poverty forward into the future. Understanding why poverty exists is fundamental to solving this blight on the landscape. As I have argued in earlier work, poverty affects and undermines us all. Yet too often we fail to understand the true nature of poverty. This misunderstanding helps to explain the paradox of poverty within a land of plenty. As a nation, we can and must do better. 2. Defining, measuring, and counting. A logical starting point to begin our exploration of poverty is to examine various ways of defining and measuring impoverishment. Moreover, how many people are considered poor in the United States, and for how long do they remain there? Finally, what background characteristics define those in poverty? Reviewing the scope and dynamics of a problem is always an excellent place to set about an initial understanding of an issue. Defining poverty. Over the centuries, poverty has been conceptualized and defined in a number of different ways. In ancient societies, the poor were often thought of as those who fell into particularly unfortunate categories, such as beggars, the sick, or the widowed. In medieval times, those in poverty would have been considered the peasant class, which encompassed most of society. More recently, Adam Smith, in his 1776 landmark treatise, The Wealth of Nations, defined poverty as a lack of those necessities that the custom of the country renders it indecent for creditable people, even of the lowest order, to be without. This type of definition is what is known as an absolute approach to defining poverty. A minimum threshold for adequate living conditions is determined, and individuals falling below that threshold are considered poor. On its surface, many of us might agree with Smith's description. However, our consensus would probably begin to break down over what exactly such necessities should encompass. Certainly most of us would include items such as food, clothing, and shelter, but what kind of food, clothing, and shelter? Furthermore, what additional items might we include? A smartphone, health insurance, internet access, a car, and so on. If we turn to the dictionary for contemporary guidance in defining poverty, Webster defined poverty in 3 ways. 1. The state or condition of having little or no money, goods, or means of support. 2. Deficiency of necessary or desirable ingredients, qualities, etc. 3. Scantiness, insufficiency. Here again we have the notion that poverty consists of a shortage of basic goods and resources, and that the lack of money is the cause of this shortage. Similarly, the World Bank defined poverty as a person is considered poor if his or her income level fall below some minimum level necessary to meet basic needs. Yet another way of thinking about how we might define poverty is to conceptualize what such a shortage means in the daily lives of individuals. It is within this context that many countries speak of poverty in terms of social exclusion or deprivation. To be poor is often to live on the outskirts of society. The economist and social philosopher Amartya Sen defined poverty in terms of a lack of basic capabilities. According to Sen, poverty implies an overall absence of individual freedom and agency. Individuals in poverty are less able to exert control over their lives. They are more likely to be stigmatized and discriminated against, less likely to be able to take advantage of certain fundamental rights such as voting, plagued by a lower life expectancy and a host of other constraints. This introduces the idea that poverty may be more than simply a lack of money. It includes aspects of life that are diminished as a result of an inadequate income. The United Nations has incorporated such a perspective into its definition of poverty for high-economy countries. The organization has included not only a lack of income, but also long-term unemployment, lower life expectancy, and overall rates of illiteracy. Consequently, there are many ways in which we might define who is poor. Nevertheless, all of these definitions touch on the idea that those in poverty are lacking the basic necessities to maintain a minimally adequate life. Measuring poverty. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson historically declared a war on poverty. Delivering his State of the Union address to Congress and the American people, the president announced, "This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America, and I urge this Congress and all Americans to join with me in that effort. It will not be a short or easy struggle. No single weapon or strategy will suffice, but we shall not rest until that war is won. The richest nation on earth can afford to win it. We cannot afford to lose it." Yet, as the administration was to learn on both the domestic and foreign battlefields, A country marching off to war must have a credible estimate of the enemy's size and strength. Surprisingly, up until this point in our nation's history, we had no official measure of poverty and therefore no statistics on its scope, shape, or changing nature. The task was therefore to come up with a way of measuring how many people in America were poor. There are several distinctions that can be made when seeking to measure poverty. These include whether to use an absolute versus a relative measure, a pre-transfer versus post-transfer measure, income or assets, earnings or consumption, and finally, monthly or yearly time intervals. Absolute versus relative measures. A first distinction in measuring poverty is between what is known as an absolute measure of poverty versus a relative measure. An absolute measure defines poverty as a household not having a specific amount of income to purchase those goods and services that are necessary for a minimally adequate life. As discussed, these would include food, shelter, transportation, utilities, and so on. An absolute measure of poverty determines how much these items cost annually, and based on that, estimates an overall dollar amount for the year. Households whose total annual income fall below this amount would be counted as poor, while those above this amount would be considered non-poor. The assumption is that there is an income floor which can be empirically calculated, and that living below that floor constitutes poverty. In this sense, such a measure is considered absolute. There is an absolute amount drawn dividing the poor from the non-poor, with an amount below that line representing material hardship. On the other hand, a relative measure of poverty looks at where a household's income falls relative to the rest of the population. One relative measure of poverty would be to consider the poor as falling into the bottom 20% or 10% of the income distribution. Another relative measure, widely used throughout the European Union, is to consider those in poverty as having incomes below 50% of a country's median income. Therefore, if median income was $60,000, then those earning less than $30,000 would be counted as poor. If median income were to rise to $70,000, then those below $35,000 would be considered in poverty. Underlying this type of measure is the concept of relative deprivation. Individuals are considered poor not necessarily because they fall below a particular set amount of income, but rather by the fact that they fall at the bottom of the income distribution. One major advantage of a relative measure, such as falling below 50% of median income, is that it allows us to more easily make comparisons across countries with respect to the extent and depth of poverty. Pre-transfer versus post-transfer measures. A second important distinction in measuring poverty is what is known as a pre-transfer versus a post-transfer measure of poverty. A pre-transfer measure of poverty relies on a household's overall annual income, but excludes any cash, in-kind benefits, or tax credits that they might receive from the government. On the other hand, a post-transfer measure of poverty includes personal earnings along with government cash programs, example Social Security or unemployment insurance, and or in-kind programs, example food stamps, as well as tax credits received in calculating a household's overall income. Policy analysts will often compare the difference in poverty rates between a pre-transfer and post-transfer measure as a way of gauging the impact that government programs have on reducing poverty. A post-transfer measure of poverty will always be lower than a pre-transfer measure. How much lower varies widely across countries. Income versus asset-based measures. A third important distinction to be made in measuring poverty is the difference between using income or assets as the measuring stick to determine whether or not a family is considered in poverty. The standard economic approach has been to use a household's income to determine whether or not they fall into poverty. It is through income that households are able to purchase those goods and services necessary for a minimally adequate lifestyle. Such a measure, however, does not take into account the value of any assets that the household may hold. On the other hand, an asset-based measure of poverty gets at the idea of whether individuals have enough assets, i.e. savings and checking accounts, to allow them to get over a period where their stream of income has been stopped. The concept here is one of protection from a rainy day. This type of measure often defines asset poverty as not having enough liquid assets to keep a household above the poverty line for 3 months. Earnings versus consumption measures. A fourth distinction that can be made regarding measuring poverty centers on whether to use earnings or consumption as the indicator of how well an individual or household is doing. Most analysts rely on earnings, which are typically measured through income. However, some have argued that a lack of consumption may be a better indicator of economic and material deprivation. For example, if very little is spent on food, housing, and other necessities, the argument is that such a household is in all likelihood in dire economic straits. One of the problems with using consumption as the measuring stick for poverty is that individuals may be choosing to consume less. In addition, consumption data on a national level are typically quite hard to come by. Yearly versus monthly measures. A final consideration in measuring poverty has to do with the amount of time under consideration. Most common is to calculate a household's income over the course of a year, and based on that amount, determine whether or not the household fell into poverty. This is what is known as an annual or yearly measure of poverty. Alternatively, one might measure poverty using a shorter or longer span of time. For example, if monthly income data are available, one could determine if a household fell into poverty during any month of the year. Although not as common as an annual measure, a monthly measure has the advantage of detecting specific periods during a year when a household may be experiencing economic troubles. An annual measure is unable to detect such fluctuations. How the official poverty measure is constructed. All of these approaches have been and continue to be discussed in policy circles. At the time of President Johnson's declared war on poverty, any one of these approaches could have been taken to assess the federal government's efforts. The task fell on an economist working for the Social Security Administration, Molly Orshansky, to devise the country's yardstick for measuring poverty. The method that Orshansky took was consistent with Adam Smith's definition 200 years earlier. That is, poverty was conceptualized as a failure to have the income necessary to purchase a basic basket of goods and services that allows for a minimally decent level of existence. The approach was therefore absolute rather than relative. The way that this was and still largely is calculated is straightforward. One begins by estimating the household cost of obtaining a minimally adequate diet during the course of the year. For example, in 2021, a family of 3 would need to spend $7,186.33 to purchase such a diet. This figure is then multiplied by 3, in the above case, $7,186.33 times 3 equals $21,559, which constitutes the official poverty line for a family of 3. The reason for using 3 as a multiplier is that Orshansky relied on a 1955 Department of Agriculture survey showing that families with 3 or more persons spent approximately 1/3 of their income on food and the remaining 2/3 on other items such as clothing, housing, heating, and so on. Thus, the logic in the above example is that if $7,186.33 will purchase a subsistence diet for a family of 3, then the remaining $14,372.67 should provide enough income to purchase the other basic necessities needed for a minimally acceptable level of existence. Several issues are important to point out regarding the official measurement of poverty. First, each year the poverty levels are adjusted to take inflation into account. Obviously, it costs more to purchase that basic basket of goods today than it did 60 years ago. The poverty thresholds are therefore raised each year to reflect the overall increase in the cost of living. Second, the measuring stick to determine whether individuals fall above or below the poverty threshold is household income. Household income is based on the annual income from all members in the household, calculated from pre-tax dollars, and does not include in-kind program benefits such as Medicaid or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or tax credits such as the Earned Income Tax Credit. It does include government cash programs such as Social Security. Third, the actual estimates of how many Americans fall below the poverty line are derived from the annual current population survey of approximately 60,000 households conducted by the U.S. Bureau of the Census each March. In this survey, households are asked to report their total income for the prior year. That includes all sources of income for each member of the household. Fourth, the levels of poverty established each year are for the entire nation, and they do not differentiate between the cost of living differences found in various parts of the country. Consequently, there are significant differences across the United States in living costs that are not factored into the official poverty measure. Trying to survive at the poverty threshold of $21,559 for a family of 3 in Des Moines, Iowa, will obviously be a different experience from trying to survive on that amount in New York City or San Francisco. Finally, the monetary amount necessary for a small household's basic needs differs from that of a larger household, and therefore the official poverty levels are adjusted for household size. For example, in 2021, the poverty level for a household of 1 was $13,788. While that of a household of 9 or more was $56,325. In Table 2.1, we can see the percentage of the U.S. population experiencing various levels of poverty. 3 different levels are shown: the official poverty measure, 1.00 poverty, poverty and near poverty, below 150% of the official poverty line, and extreme poverty, below 50% of the official poverty line. For 2021, 11.6% of the population fell below the official poverty line, representing 37.9 million individuals. 19.4% experienced poverty or near poverty, and 5.5% were living in extreme poverty. In addition to the official measure of poverty, the Census Bureau has developed an alternative measure of poverty, called the Supplemental Poverty Measure. This is intended to refine the official poverty measure by taking into account a wider variety of expenditures, adjusting for cost of living differences, and including non-cash benefits along with received tax credits in determining income. The estimates of poverty using the supplemental poverty measure tends to be slightly higher than when using the official measure of poverty, although for 2021 they were lower. In addition, poverty rates for children tend to be lower than the official measure, while poverty rates for those 65 and over are substantially higher. In the bottom panel of Table 2.1, the extent of poverty in the United States using the supplemental poverty measure is shown. According to this measure, 7.8% of the population fell into poverty in 2021, representing 25.6 million Americans. Furthermore, 19.4% of Americans were in poverty or near poverty, while 2.9% experienced extreme poverty. Dynamics of poverty. As noted, when President Johnson declared a war on poverty in 1964, there was a need to create an overall measure of poverty. As a result, a poverty line was established that determined how many people in the United States were in poverty in any given year. The measure was then backdated to 1959, which is why official statistics always begin with that year. In Figure 2.1, we can see how the overall official poverty rates have changed over the period of 60-plus years from 1959 to 2021. The top panel displays the number of Americans falling into poverty, while the bottom panel shows the poverty rates. Focusing on the rates, several patterns are apparent. From 1959 to 1973, overall poverty in the United States was cut in half.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?